switch colors, and they're going to quickly do it again. And this is the script. We talk about how Hans Nieman, better as black, and he was this close to maybe having that other storyline people talked about. What he needed to do was to get an early lead. Now he's in that storyline that people said you don't want to get here, because if the GOAT gets going, he don't stop.
And Hans is a streaky player, and sometimes that plays to his benefit where he wins a number of games in a row. But like any player, you could be victim to tilt. So he is playing a calm game 4 right now with the white pieces. That's the good news. But he may already be in results-oriented thinking. When you're playing the best player in the world and you're down by 2 points in a match that has a finite amount of time, you start thinking, I need to get those wins, but then you're not playing chess.
Yeah, you can't let any decision that has nothing to do with what's on the board affect your decisions on the board. Obviously, much easier said than done. The best players in the world do it better than all of us, but they are human, and certain players, as you said, are more shrieky than others. Certain players, like if they start off well, they're just like, what are they capable of? And so Hans doesn't want any type of streakiness to continue here, because that streak is not going well right now.
We've seen this position before. This would happen a couple games ago, and this exact position occurred, and Magnus did the same thing. He tried to open the D file, trade some rooks, and it worked out quite well for him in that game. So he took on D6 with the pawn when the capture happened. Danny, I have to think that this is good for Magnus Carlsen, because he's not required to go deep into the memory bank. He just played this position, and objectively, it's quite solid for black.
He changes up by taking the rook, which allows the queen to take, because now black will be the first one to get the d-file. If you're just tuning in, folks, this exact game occurred in game 2 when Hans Nieman played rook e to d1 there, or sorry, rook e to e1 there instead of rook takes d6. Here Hans takes on d6. I don't like the repetition from Hans, because even though that game was a draw, I liked how Hans played until he played f3 in that game. So he varied. I wish Hans had played the same line he did. I thought his position was going okay. Now he goes for something different. Maybe he wants to switch to an attack on the king side.
But let's not forget, neither of these players had the opportunity to check the line. He only knows what the result of the game was and the direction it was going. And it was all Magnus for quite a while. So this seems quite safe. For white, the knight's on f5. That's always dangerous. Some people like to call it a knife on f5 as you're trying to slice up the black king side. But it's not in time, Dan. You need to jump over this knight, bring a rook to g3. It takes so much time to make this work. The good news for Hans, Danny, is that this queen on b3 is keeping Magnus's rook honest on the b file.
I've been super into jumping over pieces variants. I really want it on chess.com. Just like, can we just get one move a game where you can put a piece and jump over your own piece? I'm just saying. We'll get on that. All right, he goes back to e1 because, jokes aside, he doesn't really have a chance to focus on the king side anymore, and you can overcommit to an attack if it's not there. So again, this is a mature move from Hans. I like it. He's staying in the game, staying focused. That shows like, hey, I'm not going to let emotions run this game. I'm not going to try to pretend there's an attack where there's not. He plays rook e1. He's got a time edge on the clock. I like what Hans is doing.
And if we count the small pluses, they actually are in white's favor. White has the better knights. This knight on c6 dominated by this pawn 3 squares away. This knight on f3 attacking, this knight defending. This knight on f5 very active here. It's actually quite a menacing piece. And now it steps back because it wants to jump to a new 5th rank square, like knight d5, and trying to go after this pawn on e5. So, Danny, I have to say that Magnus handling himself quite well. We're used to seeing him acquit himself like this. But for Hans, I mean, he is doing the right thing. He is trying to cause these little problems for Magnus. Just Magnus is in form right now.
Magnus is in form. Hans is in time, perhaps for the tactics to work as e5 will hang, but there's knight a5 at the end, so I was trying to calculate this. Let's see. Here comes knight a5. What does Hans see? Because d5 is going to fall.
That's a problem, and this knight can come into c4 in many positions as well. There is no queen a3 because the black queen will just trade and white's pawn structure will be ruined. So it looks like Magnus can take on d5, give up the e5 pawn, and that looks like equality.
Yeah, maybe that's all it is then. Hans went for it. Though pausing now makes you always wonder, right? Did they miss something before, or is there something misevaluated here? Because you go for a forcing line, you expect it to kind of play out there. So certainly Hans didn't miss knight a5, but I'm just curious what maybe he didn't evaluate that he didn't like, because you're headed to an endgame, and by the way, you're headed down on the clock, and Magnus wants. Oh, you looked at me. You gave me that Magnus look. Don't you look at me like that in here. That's the Magnus look where you said, Magnus says, I'm now playing for a win.
Yes, Magnus didn't just want to trade off more pieces, give up the e5 pawn for the d5 pawn. Instead, he says, that's a big target. Knight c4 is available, hitting b2, and that knight can always slide back to b6 to add another attacker. And I mentioned how black's knight was bad before. Suddenly, it's white's knight that is very bad. Unless it can jump forward, and it can't do that quickly enough, it looks like black's knight is actually going to do some damage.
Yeah, you did. You gave me the Magnus look. I don't know what that is. Like we'll give it something else, some other nickname. But I've gotten that look from you many times over the years, and that was like, hey, not so fast. We're not just talking about equality. Magnus senses when his opponents would be happy for that. Here comes, I mean, the knight could go to c4 and either b6 or d6. Even just put that knight on d6, you're happy from a blockading perspective, right? Because that d5 pawn is still weak. That b5 pawn helps hold it back. That's exactly what Magnus does. So again, objectively, the computer's right, everybody, but this is Magnus Carlsen, and that d5 pawn is definitely weaker than any pawn black has.
Although if the white queen can move back and then c4 can be played, we start to see that white will coordinate his forces. They'll protect that loose pawn on d5. So the queen on b4, I like that square. It can actually go to a5, hit this a6 pawn, which is loose in all these positions. So, Danny, I have to say both sides will have their chances.
Yeah, I agree. And right as I said, there is no pawn in black's camp that's as weak as d5. Hans says, wait, queen b4. I can go to a5 and a6 is weak. I can go to c5 and c7 is weak. So Magnus correctly pausing 10 seconds for station identification on the Magnus Carlsen Endgame Technique Network. He's been hosting that show for a very long time. So he's like, wait, I'm going to pause here. Let me make sure I choose the right plan before we get ourselves in an endgame.
You got to go.
Oh, I'm talking here. My partners need some water. We're talking a lot. All right, hey, live television, everybody. Let's make some noise up here. We got Magnus Carlsen, Hans Nieman. Let's go. All right, Queen h5 is played. Queen h5 is played. Okay, Magnus is going to get aggressive. That's funny that you run away from what the white queen is trying to do to go to c5 or a6. And, yeah, queen f5 is played. Will we get knight e4 or pawn to e4? That is an interesting question.
It's a tough question.
It's a tough question.
I'm tough to answer because
You're
I don't have a voice.
answer.
But
Yeah,
here
yeah.
the voice comes back. The queen on f5, it does look powerful. And knight e4, as you mentioned, one idea, pawn e4 another, because that pawn on d5, Danny, is a pawn that's extended quite far. And that's what we don't like to see. We typically think of advanced pawns going to the other side, becoming a queen. But here it's actually overextended and black.
Yeah. Well, here we go. Now we're going to focus a little bit on the players. And, okay, the d5 pawn is the biggest target. Hans Nieman still has a teeny time advantage, but that's about to go away. Will there be e4? Will there be pawn? Will the knight come to e4? We don't know. So Hans has to calculate all of these tactics. Queen f5 is threatening queen to b1 check as well. Let's make sure we don't lose sight of that. And Hans nervous here, bouncing a little bit, wants to make sure he chooses the right line. He plays a4. That's an aggressive approach over there. A weakening one potentially to the queenside pawn structure.
a4. So queen b1, followed pawn takes a4, and we see the first step in that direction. But at pawn a4, queen takes a4. That's key, because the queen trade, I was about to say, favors black, and he finds a new way of doing it, bringing the queen into e4. And Danny, this looks like trouble for Hans. Yeah,
if the queens come off, every pawn is on the agenda for black. If that knight comes to e4, d5 is weak, c3 is weak. At this point, even b3 and a4 might potentially have bleak futures, depending on what happens over there with the tension. So, and that knight on f3 is kind of dominated, not just by the pawn on e5, holding the d4 square, but the pawn on f6. So, okay, Hans has a big decision to make. He's using his time, which now means he's down on time and under a minute.
This is not the position you want, and especially against this opponent. This is Magnus Carlsen, the best endgame player you could possibly ask for. So you see Hans, he's trying to figure this out. Can he trade queens? The answer is no. He drops the pawn immediately. And if I can't trade queens because that looks bad, do I bring my queen up to a5? And it is on the rim, but it is putting pressure on c7 and a6. So at least that looks more appealing, except queen f4 check and pawn e4. The rook on d2 is loose.
Well, I'm glad you highlighted that, because okay, he played queen c5. I'm saying that's a blunder that's coming. Queen f4 check and e4. You highlighted that that's a blunder to watch out for. Hans plays queen to c5. And what happens on e4? Queen takes c7. Rook to c8. The knight is guarded by the queen, though. So I'm thinking black is winning material here.
e4 looks excellent. Knight e4, by the way, would be appealing in other positions, but this is what Magnus wanted. Queen c1, there is knight g1, so that's why the king went into the corner. It didn't slide to g1, but Magnus plays knight f5, just going after this rook. If rook b4, there's pawn a5. Get out of here. Get off the fourth rank. Stop pinning this e4 pawn, says Magnus. He won't
overwork. You want to keep pinning the pawn on e4, but if you leave the d file, stranger things will happen. Okay, Hans finds a kind of a chaos move here, right? Guerrilla warfare. Throw a grenade in and jump out and see what happens here. But Magnus doesn't normally fall for that type of stuff. He'll figure out the tactics.
It's a smart move to try to get in the trenches, because if you do take on d6 with the pawn, this queen slides over to d5 with check and then picks up this e4 pawn as that black king is in the line of sight. So rook takes d6 played, and it was a mistake, but looking at the clocks, I think that's the biggest hurdle for Hans right now.
Yeah. Rook takes d6, and now c takes d6. Hans down on the time there. We're gonna address the visual there. We're having trouble seeing the white clock as every time it's ticking. That's actually just a font issue. So there's, just so you know, there's no issue right there with the players not seeing the time of game. That is something only we can all see as fans watching this. So everybody take a breath. The players are not seeing that. That is just a color issue with the time disappearing. We'll get it fixed. Okay, knight to d4 played.
Just trying to trade off the pieces.
Trying to trade off pieces.
The black king, it's not the safest square for it. You would hope that there are more pawns safeguarding it, but with some weak light squares, there could be some checks against it, and if you can't parry them off, that will give white drawing chances. But that's why Magnus, he presses forward, pawn to f5. Hans really is barely getting his moves off. 0.4 seconds when he made that last move, and the white queen is in, but unfortunately for Hans, that the black queen is centralized. I mean, look at this, Danny. E3 happens, C3 will be loose, and maybe queen f4, queen f2.
Oh, it's happening. It's happening. The queen comes in, the e-pawn will run. There is no perpetual. Ooh, Magnus wants more. He's going to take pawns with check and make sure that he works it with no diggity here. He might even get the queens off the board before he advances e2. No, now queen f5 check was easier, but two queens will get the job done. Magnus Carlsen has a 3-game lead.